Hey everyone, it's Simi Shah, and welcome to Trailblazers. Through this series, we bring you trailblazing by South Asians and for South Asians. We're the torchbearers, sharing the stories of the leaders and innovators lighting the way across the South Asian diaspora. Welcome everyone to Season 2, Episode 4. I'm so excited to welcome Anita Kumar to the podcast today. She serves as Politico's White House Correspondent and Associate Editor. She began her career in local and state politics, writing for the Washington Post and Tampa Bay Times, among other news organizations. And prior to moving to Politico in 2019, she covered the White House for McClatchy's, one of the country's biggest local news companies. They own 29 papers around the United States. She reported on Trump's reelection campaign in 2020, Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016, and Obama's reelection campaign in 2012. And now she covers the Biden admin. A trailblazer in grassroots and national newsrooms, Anita also became the first Indian American journalist elected to the board of the White House Correspondents Association. I am so thrilled to welcome this trailblazer to the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with your beginnings in local newsrooms. You are organizations from the renowned Tampa Bay Times to the news and record publication of Greensboro, North Carolina. How did these experiences help you cut your teeth as a journalist?
These days, a lot of people that just graduate from college that want to go into journalism just come to Washington. But when I graduated, the pattern used to be you got the job where you could. You went to a local small paper and kind of worked your way up. So I always knew that I wanted to be in newspapers. So I just basically was trying to get a job anywhere I could. So I actually started at a small paper in Lynchburg, Virginia, and I'm from Virginia, so it was not too far from my parents. It's just a small newsroom, so you just do everything. My first job was, I did not like it. My first job was night cops, which is basically you're the reporter on duty, on call for the evenings. So, okay, that's the first reason you don't like it, because you're working evenings. And so you just write about whatever happens, if there's a fatal car accident or a shooting or whatever, you just write about that. I didn't do that for very long. There was an opening and I quickly moved up the chain, but you just learn how to do a lot of different things. I mean, you just learn about how different governments work. So local government, the police department, the courthouse, all of those things. I quickly went to local government. So that's where I felt like I learned a lot about how government works. And then I went to state government and now, of course, federal government. So I've had all those experiences, and maybe it would have been great to come to Washington and cover the White House when I was so much younger, but I really had the best times and learned so much in those different places that I worked, and I really loved it.
Yeah, absolutely. And was your inclination towards national politics always there? Was that always the goal?
No, not really. I mean, I know a lot of people think that that's their goal. It wasn't not my goal. I just didn't really know what that goal would be. I worked the longest before I came to Washington in Florida, which is really a bizarre place. It's just, there's no seasons and there's lizards. It just was it was a weird place, but there was so much news there. And I really felt at home at the Tampa Bay Times. I have a lot of friends that are still there or left journalism and they're still living there. It never really occurred to me what I would do next. I wasn't sure. I just knew it would be in journalism, but it wasn't necessarily that I would do national politics. And then they offered me a job to come to Washington in their bureau here. And so I said, sure. And so I joined a 3-person bureau in Washington. And then once I was here, I knew that I wouldn't leave or go back.
Wow, that's amazing. I want to spend a second on that in terms of the Tampa Bay Times and covering news in Florida. I remember when there was a lot of conversation happening about how local news organizations have broken some of the biggest stories in America. The Tampa Bay Times was one of those that came up. Can you just speak to that general trend of local news serving civil society in a way that people don't always realize?
I think one thing that people don't realize because it doesn't get as much attention is that sometimes, I know this happens all the time, and of course I can't think of one off the top of my head, but a local paper or radio station or TV station actually breaks a story first. And it doesn't get a ton of attention until it's in a national publication, until it's in the New York Times or the Washington Post or Politico. And then you have to stop and remember, well, wait, someone else already reported on this, right? I mean, it was out there. And it's because those reporters know the community so well. When I was doing local and state government, I had a different relationship with the people that I cover than I do in Washington. For local news, you're in their community. You might see them out and about at the grocery store or when you're taking a walk. It's just a different kind of relationship because you're in the same community they are. Now, of course, I live in the same community as President Biden and the administration, but I'm not seeing them all the time. It's not as small of a place. And you don't have, I don't think, as much of a direct impact on what happens. So there were times when I worked in Tallahassee or Richmond, Virginia, covering the state houses there, where I would write something and it would change what the governor did or it would change what the legislature did. And that's just an amazing experience. And while that does happen some in Washington, it doesn't quite happen as much.
Yeah. Is there any part of you that misses being able to have that sort of impact?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I wouldn't trade what I'm doing now because it has a ton of other benefits. I get to see history in the making and travel around the world, not during coronavirus, but generally gotten to do some just amazing things that I never would have thought possible. But on the journalism side, it's hard to explain. It's just such an experience to sort of wake up and realize that something you wrote or did changed the course of what was going to happen, and you hope for the best. And that people are really reading you and understanding what's going on, but also that people, powerful people, are reading you and deciding what they need to do based on what you've reported.
Yeah, and I want to take a second to speak about that power. You obviously cover the White House and have covered 3 presidents thus far. How did you get there? Obviously, you landed yourself in Washington, you were working on national politics, but why specifically the White House?
That's a great question. I also didn't sort of dream of doing that. It just was, I knew I wanted to stay in Washington, like I mentioned before. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that is because there were so many options here. So that's the one big difference between sort of being in Richmond, Virginia, which I loved. I just loved living and working there for the Washington Post. But I had the job I was going to have there. There's really sort of in journalism, nothing else I would have done there. But here in Washington, there's just so many news outlets. There's so many different opportunities to cover different things from the Supreme Court to the White House to Congress and all different agencies. So I was pretty happy where I was at the Washington Post. And a friend of mine worked at McClatchy, and I saw the job posting for a White House reporter. And I wasn't sure that I was going to make that leap. It's kind of a hard thing to leave the Washington Post. It is a paper. So I didn't have a beat that I wanted to always cover, but I always did want to work there. And I was thrilled to be there. So I wasn't sure if I would leave. So I just decided to talk to someone about this job, and I got the job. And so that was a very difficult decision to decide whether to leave. And actually, I'm trying to think in my career, probably it's been the hardest decision. I think every other
Yeah.
time had been fairly easy, but that was a tough one. And so I decided that I could sort of wait at the Washington Post and eventually cover the White House, or I could just go over to McClatchy, which I really respected, but was a different kind of news outlet, and cover the White House. And so I did it, and it was a great experience.
No, that's super interesting. I guess I'm curious, what are the nuances to covering national politics for an organization like McClatchy's, where you're effectively giving it to local daily papers?
Yeah, so it's different. I think it's changed some since I've left. So I've been gone a couple years, and I think that McClatchy, if people don't know it, has declared bankruptcy and then has gone through a lot of financial troubles, which is why I left. Not because it wasn't a good fit, it was going through a lot of tough times, like so many news outlets and so many local news outlets. It's very disappointing to see. I think they're changed a little bit, but when I was there, the editors that I had basically said I could write what I wanted, write good stories. I would say the one big difference is that McClatchy feels like, and it's a pretty big bureau in Washington, but they still felt like they couldn't compete on every little thing. So this is particularly during Donald Trump's tenure, but also during Barack Obama's. There are not enough people there to cover every single tweet or every single thing that happens. And so my job was basically to find good stories and write those stories. And I didn't write every day. I probably wrote a couple times a week or even less, and spent more time on stories that were sort of bigger takeouts. So the big difference, I think, working there was that I didn't write all the things that were happening just because we couldn't compete with the New York Times that has a huge bureau and that sort of thing. That's really different. I mean, at Politico, we do write that, but I'm one of so many people that I'm generally not writing that anyway, but we are covering it all. So it's just a different mentality. I think also that there's an idea that you really care about the communities that are McClatchy communities, right? So the flagship, the company's based in Sacramento, California. Some of the bigger papers were in North Carolina and Kansas, Missouri, that area we would care about. So you think about those things, but I wouldn't say that every story was about one of those areas. If it had something that was important to California, that might be a great story for me, but I might have done it anyway, if that makes sense. So it's just a different perspective.
Yeah. There's so much there that I want to touch on, but what jumped out at me was when you were talking about your decision to leave McClatchy's and obviously the financial turmoil it's faced. There's been a trend generally with local news of potentially going bankrupt because the advertising model isn't working anymore. And on top of that, being acquired by hedge funds. And I know McClatchy was bought in an auction by Chatham Asset Management. I'm just curious how you felt about that and what your thoughts are on this general trend in the industry.
I mean, I knew that it was bought, obviously. I don't really know much about that hedge fund, but I was very sad when they declared bankruptcy. I remember texting with my friends that were there or had left there. When I left, a lot of people left around that time because of the financial difficulties. And I remember when the McClatchy family, didn't own it anymore. Kevin McClatchy, who I knew and had met a number of times, was the person who was running it for the family. It was just really, really sad. I mean, it's not just McClatchy, it's all these news companies all over the country. Politico is the first place I work that it's not a newspaper per se. I mean, there is a print edition sometimes when Congress is in session, but it was a different kind of thing. I never thought I would work for a place that wasn't a traditional newspaper, and it's the first time I've done that. But I just felt like to a lot of people, they don't realize the difference, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's just you go to a website and you read something. It meant a lot to me and it felt really weird. And I didn't know if I wanted to do it. And I found it kind of sad, but it hasn't been different in terms of I'm writing stories and they publish on the internet and people read them. So for a lot of people, it doesn't make a difference. What does make a difference is that Politico found a business model that works.
Yeah.
And it has a ton of readers and they're not having financial problems like McClatchy and so many other outlets.
Yeah.
So it was really hard to make that change for a different reason than leaving the Washington Post, just because it's a different kind of journalism. But in the end, I didn't feel that much different.
That's great to hear, especially because I think from a consumer perspective, you want to know that the journalism to some degree is being done the same way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what advice you would offer to journalists that are just starting out, just graduating college, who have probably been advised to go the traditional route where you start in a local paper and then you work your way to Washington or some other big bureau when a lot of these local organizations are dying. What advice would you have for them?
I don't know that people are being told that anymore. I feel like more and more people are just being told you can go to Washington and get a job because there's so many people that are doing that. I would actually advise that it is a great path to sort of cut your teeth in local news. You learn things that you never learn in Washington because people sort of assume you know that or you know how to do that. And you learn how to cover things and what's important at the local level and the state level that you can in Washington, I feel like. So I think it's a great opportunity to work your way up and that there's plenty of time to get to other places. I feel like everybody wants to do what they think is the, I don't know, cool thing or the thing that they should do, which is come to Washington, cover whatever, the Supreme Court. I think it's actually not only a great experience because you learn a lot, but it was just so much fun. You are in a smaller place and you know all your colleagues so well and you're in your 20s and you're hanging out. So I just think there's a lot to learn there and it's also a fun experience. So I would just advise people it's okay to do that.
No, that makes a ton of sense. I do want to talk a little bit about your time covering presidential administrations, obviously, because it's super fascinating, particularly in the last decade. I'm curious now working with Politico and having covered Obama and now covering Biden and Hillary Clinton and Trump, what are some of the most critical skills you think you have needed and journalists need to cover presidents?
Well, there's so many things, I guess. One thing would be just to be able to juggle a lot of things and maybe a lot of different industries. That's a great skill. But I feel some people can, they work on something and they work on that until it's done. Well, that's just not how it is covering the White House because things are happening today that you might need to jump in on. You're working on something that you might spend a couple days on, something that you might spend a week on. And there's just lots of different things happening. And basically my days generally are talking to people or writing things, but I might make one call on one story and then write something else that's unrelated. And so I just think there's a lot of juggling involved. When you're physically with the president, so you're at the White House or you're traveling, I think you just need to learn to be fast and as accurate as possible. It's the same skill that a lot of reporters have when they're covering a debate. And it doesn't have to be a presidential debate, it could be a Senate debate between two candidates, or if they're covering a legislative session like I did so many years where you cover something and you just have to write quick and everybody just wants to know what happened. So those sound like things that reporters always have to do, but there's just no comparison to flying on Air Force One and having like 10 minutes to write something. And I'm not kidding. And you have to file it on your iPhone because that's the way it's done. The first time
Wow.
when I started covering the president in McClatchy in 2012, I think I had my first 2 weeks were the Democratic and Republican convention. So that's kind of weird. Then I was supposed to leave and go with President Obama on a trip, be part of the crew that travels with him. And I was going to have to file reports, pool reports, as we call them, for all the other reporters on an iPhone that I had just gotten. And I had a BlackBerry before that. And an
Oh
iPhone and a
my
BlackBerry is
gosh.
super different. And I was really afraid that I wasn't going to be able to do it. I was trying to figure out how the iPhone works. And I know that sounds weird, but obviously you quickly pick it up. But I was so afraid that I wasn't going to be able to send it. And all these hundreds of reporters were going to be waiting to find out what happened. But it all worked out.
Wow, that's amazing. So I guess I'm curious, what is it like to form that bond or relationship with the president covering the administration?
Well, I don't know. I feel like only a handful of reporters, and depending on the president, really have any kind of relationship, right? Because remember, there are hundreds of reporters at the White House, generally, not during coronavirus. So hundreds of reporters. But I would say that the presidents sort of know those top outlets, they know the top reporters. And then it's even a smaller crew that travel with him. So I think that even though there's hundreds of people that are in the White House, there's a smaller group of outlets that are traveling on Air Force One because it costs money. And so I think they get to know those people a little bit better. More importantly, I think, or not more importantly, but more obvious is that you're getting to know the staff, the president's staff, because they're the ones that you're interacting with all the time. It's not like the president is always interacting with the reporters. He's not back in the press cabin of Air Force One talking every time. Well,
Yeah.
Donald Trump did, but not every day. And President Obama barely did that. And I'm sure President Biden won't do it very often. So Donald Trump was so unusual in so many ways.
Okay.
So I think it's a lot of getting to know the staff. They are also getting to know you.
Yeah, something that you just highlighted that I think is interesting is there's clearly differences in the way that presidential administrations and their staff interact with the press. What have been the specific differences you've noticed in covering three different presidents?
Well, President Biden is similar to President Obama, I would say. There are a lot of similarities there, and of course, they work together. President Trump was just so different in so many ways. He liked to interact with the media. So you could bet that if you were traveling with him or at the White House, there might be a time in that particular day, in a day, that he would come out and talk. Whether that's when he's getting on the helicopter to go somewhere or when he's already somewhere, he wanted to have reporters right in front of him. He wanted the cameras. And that's a thing that we just haven't seen. We didn't see with President Obama, and we haven't seen yet with President Biden. I mean, it's been several weeks, more than a month, and President Biden hasn't had a news conference yet. So that's pretty telling. By this time, President Obama had one. So it's different. President Biden very much wanted the daily press briefing to be back. And so it's back. And so we interact with Jen Psaki every day, or some reporters do interact with her every day. And so that's different. I think that President Trump was just so unusual in that he wanted it all for himself. He didn't want the press secretary out there every single day. He wanted to do the interviews. He wanted to call into the TV station and the radio station, and he wanted the reporters in front of him. So that's been really different.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And do you have any particularly memorable experiences on certain stories you've reported where just the cadence of interaction or the news that you've learned or the way you went about the reporting has just really stuck with you?
I mean, there's so many. It's hard to choose. I remember early in President Trump's tenure, I was at the White House. And I can't remember now why I was there, if I was there for something else or if I was back before coronavirus. People used to work from the White House and we would take turns working there. And it was the day that he fired Jim Comey, the FBI director. And we didn't really know Donald Trump that well then, or at least I didn't. I didn't cover him during the campaign. I covered Hillary Clinton. So I came into the administration not knowing him and how he worked. And we were all sort of like in disbelief. Remember, that was the thing that everybody was like, is he going to do this? And everybody was like, no, he won't do that.
Yeah.
And then he did it. And no one knew that it was coming. And when we heard about it, I was one of the first people who heard because I was right there. But we almost kind of didn't believe it. Like, really? Did this just happen? And I remember thinking, oh, this is how it's going to be. And it was for the next 3.5 years or 4 years. It was basically like Friday night tweets where he's firing someone, or the thing that you think will never happen happened. So over and over again, over 4 years, I kept thinking something would be so surprising, so startling, and yet I wouldn't be surprised because I knew that it would be the most surprising thing ever would happen. I covered a lot of ethics issues, and I still do. And so I covered a lot with President Trump. And I remember when he was getting criticized right and left from everyone, including Republicans, for saying that he would hold the G7 summit at one of his resorts in Florida. And I was like, oh, he'll never do that because he's gotten so much criticism about it. And then he did it. You know, I hate this phrase that people use all the time, but he doubled down on it. I mean, he said he was going to do it. And I was so surprised and yet not surprised because that's how it felt every single time.
Have you felt a sort of calm now that President Biden has transitioned into office in terms of reporting?
Yeah, it's definitely different. I haven't had some crazy Friday night. The weekends are pretty quiet. They schedule everything, right? So they have a message that they want to put out in a day, right? Where they have a conference call with reporters or a press briefing or the president speaks. And that's what they want to talk about. Now, obviously, we write about tons of things that they aren't wanting to talk about that particular day, but it's just less chaotic. I've been getting used to it, but there's not 20 things happening a day. And it's still busy. I still think there's a lot of things to write about, mostly because he's new and there's a lot of new things happening, right? New policies and new staff. So there's a lot to cover, but that feels different. I mean, the other thing that feels different for me, because I didn't cover him during the campaign, I covered Donald Trump, is that once again, I covered the person who lost the election, right, in 2016 and 2020. So then the person comes in, new president, so Donald Trump and now Joe Biden, and I'm busy trying to get to know, you know, people that are close to Joe Biden or people that are working in the White House or people that worked on his campaign. And I know some reporters don't have to do that because they've been covering him for a year or two. So for me, this is the second time that I'm having to do it. And it makes it really busy in the beginning because every person, every story you want to do, you have to think twice about who to call because those aren't people that you're talking to every single day.
That's super interesting. I didn't realize there was that learning curve, but it makes sense in the grand scheme of things.
I still remember, so in 2016, I was with Hillary Clinton at her victory party, which wasn't a victory, and she wasn't actually there. It was at the Javits Center in New York. And I stayed in New York. Obviously, everybody was surprised she lost. And I stayed for the next day. And then my editor at McClatchy said, okay, well, hurry up and come on back. So I came back to Washington. And that next day, which I think was 2 days after the election, was the day that President Obama invited then President-elect Donald Trump to the White House. And we, McClatchy, had a front row seat because there's a small group of reporters that are always with the president called the pool. And I was in the pool. McClatchy was in the pool that day. And so it was me. So I came back and I remember standing in a little line with the other members of the media that are also in the pool at the White House, right outside the Oval Office, 2 days after the election. And I knew no one. I thought I would know all these Hillary Clinton people going into the White House. And I knew none of these Donald Trump people. And I remember standing with another reporter from the Associated Press who had covered Donald Trump a little bit and who was pointing people out that were on the lawn where we're standing. You can see other people that are, I guess the first lady was there. I don't even remember, but I remember her pointing to someone and saying, well, that's Jared Kushner. And I was like, well, who's Jared Kushner? I didn't actually even, maybe I knew the name, but I didn't really know how important he would become and who he was. And she was like, well, that's his son-in-law. And of course, at the time, we didn't know he was going to go into the administration. We didn't really know anything. So I still remember that is how little I knew about Donald Trump 2 days after the election.
Wow, that's crazy. I'm sure reflecting now, realizing how much you probably had to listen to, write about, and hear about Jared Kushner. Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. I'm curious, obviously in recent years, partially because of the sensationalization of media in the realm of politics and just broadly speaking, media and journalists have received a lot of criticism. How have you grappled with that? What challenges have you faced in that respect?
So I think every journalist does something different with this. And I see that a lot of my friends and colleagues, both at Politico and elsewhere, respond to it, right? So if they're criticized on Twitter or in an email, they'll write back. And my practice has been to ignore it. And I don't know, I think there's some benefits to both, right? If you write back, if you're standing up for yourself and saying, nope, you're wrong, I'm not biased, or this is an accurate story, or this is a story that we should do because blank, blank, and blank, and you can kind of put that out there. I just don't know that I'm going to change anyone's mind because I feel like so many people today are divided. And people read what they want to read, meaning so many people get their news from Facebook or Twitter that they're only following the people that are like them, right? So that they think the same way and they have the same views. So if they see something else, it's almost like they don't believe it anymore, right? And I say that on both sides. I feel like Democrats say it and I think Republicans say it. And so I'm not sure that I'm going to change anyone's mind. And I'm really busy all the time, like every minute. That's one of the things about covering the White House is you're just busy all the time. And so I just have made it a practice to not respond. There's some times where I really do because they're just wrong, but I just try to ignore it. And so I've done that. And I know people think that that's not the way to go, but it's the way that's carried me through. I don't ignore it because I still see it, right? It's hard to ignore, but I don't respond.
I think that's a really powerful reaction to situations like that, and probably a hard one for most people. So props to you for that. I'm curious, you've alluded to the fact that this criticism is part of the reason you don't lean into your South Asian identity. Can you speak to that?
I think I get more criticism, or definitely different criticism, because I'm a woman and because that I'm not white, I guess. I suppose that others in other races get the same thing. I only know about myself. So I definitely get things that are comments that are directed to me because I'm a woman and because of my race. I know this because they're very specific about what they say. They mention India. Some people don't know where I'm from, so they mention Pakistan. They mention Muslim. I'm not Muslim. They ask questions, but they're critical because of that. And they use words that I wouldn't use here. I mean, they're not right, but they're also not nice. And I feel like if I talk about that more, and I know a lot of people do this, a lot of people talk about it, a lot of people share mean, horrible emails and tweets that they get with their followers. And I just don't do that. I think if I do that, I just open myself up to more criticism.
Yeah.
And I already know that I get criticized for that. So why bring more attention to it? I think that it's then it'll go on for longer, if that makes sense. And I also don't want people to think I'm where I am or doing what I'm doing because I'm a woman or because I'm Indian American or South Asian or Asian American, whichever we want to use today. And so I don't talk about it. And I know that some people, other reporters of different backgrounds who are not white, non-white reporters say, well, you should lean into it because then people will say, look at this Indian American who's on national television talking about the news of the day or wrote this story everybody's talking about. And maybe I could get more publicity that way and people would know my name more. But I have never felt comfortable doing it and just haven't done it.
I said this in your response to what you said previously in dealing with criticism, but I think it's a very powerful thing and a very personal thing to choose to do that. And I respect that decision a ton. I'm curious if you feel your identity has impacted you in subconscious ways or in a more under the radar way, and that you don't lean into it in terms of your public persona, but it's informed the way you go about reporting?
I'm trying to think about that. Some reporters report on certain topics because of their background, but because I cover the White House and everything I've covered has sort of been a different kind of thing, right? It's just a basic thing covering the government. I'm not sure, but I think I come to it with a different perspective just because we just did this exercise at Politico a couple weeks ago. It was about diversity. It was to help everyone sort of understand where we're coming from. And I remember being in this little group with a bunch of other journalists at Politico. And one of them had said that they had never been in a room where they felt different from other people. It was a white woman. And that was the question. She was answering a question from someone. And I have been thinking about that for a couple weeks now because I've never been in a room where I felt the same as everyone. Even if you're with another Indian American or South Asian, it's probably like one person, right? So usually it's a group of people who are white or white and black. And so I've always felt that my whole life. So I think that perspective is you do think of that in the back of your head all the time when you're thinking about, different groups or covering different people. Some people don't get their voice heard,
Yeah.
right? They are the person in the room that doesn't get their voice heard. So I think about it. I don't think it's anything conscious though, because of what I cover. It's just the way I think about different things.
Yeah.
I will say that there's one thing has been interesting with Donald Trump. He really tried to make inroads with Indian Americans.
Yep.
And I've actually written a lot of stories about it. I think it was news and I think there was a lot to write about. And so I'm glad I did. But I mean, I clearly was more interested probably because it was Indian Americans.
Yeah.
So I did, not a ton of stories, but I did write about that. I was fortunate that I got to go with President Obama to India when he went for Republic Day. And I went with President Trump to India last year, which just I can't believe because it was right before coronavirus. It was actually a week ago this year, or a year ago this week, I should say. And I was in the world's biggest cricket stadium with 110,000 Indians who weren't wearing masks because we didn't know about coronavirus at the time. And I have been thinking about that trip a ton because of COVID. And also, that was the trip where, if you remember, he came home, he flew home. And while he was flying home, one of the doctors that works for the administration had a conference call with reporters and told them, oh, life as we know it is going to change in the United States because of this thing called coronavirus that people didn't really know about. And he got so angry because he didn't want the news out yet. So I've been thinking a lot about that trip. But
Wow.
yeah. So anyway, I have been fortunate that I have that interest, of course, in India and that I've gotten to cover some things that relate to it.
It's interesting. Our community has typically been relatively politically disengaged, and that is changing a ton right now, not just in terms of voter participation, but also running for office and just being more politically involved. The relationship between the United States and India making headlines. I'm curious, what your thoughts are on it as a reporter and your experiences having traveled with presidents and seen that interaction.
Yeah, I definitely think that Indians here in the United States, Indian Americans, are getting more involved. It was really interesting because of what I found during this last election is that older Indian Americans, maybe those that grew up even in India and came here, like my parents, might support Donald Trump. Not all of them, but they would be, if there was an Indian in the United States that supported Donald Trump, it usually was an older person. And then the younger people really supported Biden. Indian Americans tend to vote Democratic, so it was going to be tough for Donald Trump to win over some of them, but he did win over some. And I actually wrote a story that when Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris, that really undercut the message, right? Because
Yep.
now Indian Americans have someone at the White House
That they can see in themselves.
they can see represents them and that sort of thing. So think that Indian Americans were very excited about that and about her being on the ticket.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious in terms of covering politics and also especially the hoopla of the last 4 years. Do you ever experience fatigue from covering this world?
All the time, especially during the last 4 years, right? Sometimes you just want to not think about it. And I'm fortunate that at Politico, there's such a large team. So I'm not needing to be watching everything all the time because I have colleagues that do that too. I think the big thing for me is, obviously, I work hard and my hours are long. So, yeah, I'm physically tired sometimes. But it's more that when I want to take a break from politics and just talk about something else. Obviously, I have a lot of friends that are journalists, but I also have a lot of friends that aren't journalists. And I find that when I'm, of course, before coronavirus, when you're sitting around talking to friends, even that aren't journalists, it turns back to politics, or at least it does with a lot of my friends. And I just don't want to talk about it all the time. I particularly felt that after January 6th. I was not obviously at the Capitol. I had a lot of colleagues that were there, but I felt it very deeply because of what I do and that I was covering Donald Trump. And I remember going to meet someone outside, to meet some people outside right after that. And I really just needed a break from that. And it's all they wanted to talk about, which was completely understandable, particularly into the Washington area, because, a lot of people here, if they're not in government, they know someone who is,
They're
or they
around
have a
it.
spouse or, a friend. And
Yep.
so it was the talk. It was the talk. And I just felt like I needed a break from it.
Yeah. Would you ever consider switching to a different sort of news?
Yeah, I think I've never been one of those people when I started covering the White House that I was going to do this forever. And I will change at some point. I just don't know when that'll be.
That makes sense. I want to spend time talking a little bit about the fact that you are covering the Biden administration right now and just some general things that you've covered and noticed in these first couple months. I think something that's obvious right now is the conversation around Jamal Khashoggi and the administration's decision to not really do anything about the fact that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was probably involved in his assassination. As a journalist, how do you feel about that professionally and personally?
Yeah, it's been interesting because he's getting a lot of criticism for not doing it. And I saw that the publisher of the Washington Post wrote an op-ed about it that was pretty
Yeah, I
harsh.
saw that you showed
And
that.
Democrats on Capitol Hill are really criticizing. It's been interesting to me because, you always think sort of in the beginning of a presidency that there's sort of a little bit of a honeymoon, particularly with your own party, right? But he's not really getting that on this. And also a couple other things, but this has been one of the biggest ones, I would say, where the White House has had to defend the position not to do more. And you kind of look at it and you kind of wonder if that's going to change, because it just depends on sort of how much pressure is on him. And I think my sense from talking to people that are in the Biden world is that, and this is not about him, this is more about Donald Trump. You feel like if you come after Donald Trump, and there were so many things that people criticized, that pretty much most things that you do, if you're not Donald Trump, you're going to get praised for. And that sounds kind of funny, but I think actually what's happening is that because Joe Biden came after Donald Trump, he has to do more than anyone's done before, right?
Yeah.
He has to restore confidence in the federal government and the presidency in a way that no president before him had to do. And I actually think the pressure's on him more than it has been on other recent presidents. And it's something I hadn't really thought about until now. We're in the moment, we're in these few weeks. And I say that about Khashoggi because Donald Trump didn't
Do anything.
didn't do anything. But I also say that about other things. I mean, my last story actually that I wrote was about how the Biden administration is doing way better than the Trump administration did on openness and transparency in government.
But you wrote about how not as much as the Obama admin.
Yeah, and they're like, well, wait, they came after Donald Trump, compare him to Donald Trump. Well, I am, but what I found is that people are saying he has to do more than anyone's ever done because he came after Donald Trump. I never thought about that. So I wonder if they had thought about it, or if they think that's an unfair criticism. I'm just not really sure. But, the Khashoggi thing, death and what has happened has been more stark, I think, than a lot of different things, because you're right. Donald Trump not only didn't do what people wanted, he supported not doing what people wanted. Sometimes when you're criticized, you don't really talk about it.
Yep.
But he actually talked about it. I was remembering when this came out. I didn't cover the report. My colleague did. When the report came out, number one, Donald Trump wouldn't release the report. But number two, he supported not doing anything. See, so many things that happen now. I like sort of remember where I was or what I was doing at the time. I was in Japan with Donald Trump in 2019 and was at a press conference where someone else asked about Jamal Khashoggi because he was meeting with the Crown Prince that day. He had met with him earlier and didn't really get an answer to a question. And I remember I followed up and I asked him, about something relating to Khashoggi. And he said, "Oh, we don't have the intelligence on that." And I said, "Well, actually, I hadn't reported it, but the news was out that the intelligence report said he was behind it." And he dismissed that. He said he couldn't talk about it. And then he said that the crown prince who he'd met with that day was really, really angry about it. Some things just stick with you, and I will remember that one forever, because he said, "Oh, well, he's so angry about it." And then here we found he was responsible.
Wow. I'm sure there are other moments in your coverage of Donald Trump where it was probably just a bit of like a strange feeling to see what ethically felt right and versus like his actual actions. And I'm curious, I know you're from Virginia, and obviously Charlottesville happened in 2017. And that was an instance in which he really didn't do anything, if almost supporting the white supremacist rally. Curious what your thoughts are being from that place and having covered him at the time.
Yeah, not only am I from Virginia, that's my hometown. So my dad was a professor at UVA, which is obviously in Charlottesville. It was just such a surreal feeling, unrelated to Donald Trump, to just hear my hometown being in the national news. I mean, I think a lot of people know it because UVA is there and it's on these lists of nice place to live, but it's not a huge city or anything like that. And so, unrelated to him for a minute, it was just crazy to think that my hometown was on national news for this happening. And my parents still live there outside Charlottesville.
Wow.
I just, I don't know how I felt about it. I was just watching him and watching sort of people talk about it. And it just felt like, I don't know how to explain it. It just felt really surreal. Is this really happening? Are people really talking about this and saying these things? And I still couldn't get over that the actual event happened there, right? What happened actually in town, and that Donald Trump had sort of said one thing and then said another thing. With him, it was so much of, sometimes he says the thing that people want him to say, and then the next time he says something off the cuff and then it goes right back. And that was something that disappointed so many of his supporters or Republicans, that they feel like he does the right thing sometimes, but it's really because this is what someone told him to say, right? Or
Yep.
he wrote it down and it's a teleprompter or something, and then he's off the cuff and says something else. So I guess I was used to it, but it just felt really different because it was my hometown.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. Obviously, like I said, the Biden administration's come to town. It's a change in party and administration and also the way things generally operate. What do you expect you'll be focusing on as it relates to this administration with your team at Politico?
Well, I know one thing that I will write about, and I have been, and I've been writing about it for a long time, is immigration. I've been writing about that for years and years, and I'm not really sure how it happened. I just started doing it, and I feel like I have a good grasp on what's going on. And because I covered so many things with President Obama and President Trump on what they were trying to do, I feel like now I kind of have a sense of how President Biden has basically got his hands full. It's so hard in this country to change the immigration laws. And I've been really struck by how hard it is, how slow they are. And I'm not saying that in a critical way. I'm just saying it's one of those really, really tough issues. And I think that on so many issues, but immigration included, people thought, okay, well, Joe Biden's coming in on January 20th, everything's going to change. And it's just, the reality is that's just not how politics and government work. It takes a long time to change things, both because Congress has its own dysfunctions and differences, but also because when one president puts something into place, generally it's not something you can just change overnight. Sometimes you can, but sometimes you get challenged in court. Sometimes it's a regulation that took months to put into place, maybe a year, and so it might take a year to unwind it. And I think that there was this sense that Joe Biden would just come in and change everything. Sure, there was this sense when Barack Obama came in too. Oh, he'll change everything George W. Bush did. And what the presidents find and their teams find and the public finds is it's not that easy. With immigration, we saw the new Secretary of Homeland Security really talking this week about how you've got to give us time. These are tough issues. We can't change it all overnight. And I think that's a message on immigration, but a lot of other issues too.
Yeah. Does that ever strike you? I mean, I find it interesting because I think in the world of social media, people will latch onto a headline like deportations or this situation with Jamal Khashoggi where they say he's not doing what he promised he'd do or what we thought he'd do. But you as a journalist being more deeply embedded in the administration coverage of it, understand there's more intricacies there and nuance there. Does that ever bother you? How do you think about that?
Well, I think it doesn't bother me, but I think it's a good thing to write about is to explain that you can't do everything overnight. I actually did write a story, I think it was before President Biden was sworn in, but that it's going to take years to undo some of these immigration things that they are eager to undo. I think it's actually a good story. And I don't mean that in a good way, but I mean, it's something to tell people, it's something to write and explain to people. So I think it's important to know that. I think that what you also see at the beginning of a presidency, of course, Joe Biden was in the White House for 8 years, he was vice president. But I don't think until you get into the Oval Office and until you're president, you fully understand the ramifications of, or how hard things are going to be, or
Yep.
what the consequences are. I mean, none of us understand that because we're not there.
Yeah.
But I think until you're there in that moment, it's tough to say, oh, I'm going to do this. And then you come in there and there's all sorts of things you have to think about. He also didn't know he would have a 50-50 Senate, right? He didn't know
Yeah.
how slim the majority would be of Democrats in the House. So I just think there's all sorts of factors you can't know. But for me, that's a good incentive for me to write and explain those things.
Absolutely. How are you thinking about doing journalism in the age of coronavirus? Obviously, things are winding down, but I'm sure it still makes the job a little bit tough. What have been the challenges there? How are you navigating them?
So hard. In the beginning, I didn't leave my house really. I don't really actually leave my house very much. So to me, one of the best things about covering the White House is traveling. I love traveling. And I love traveling, even if it's just to North Carolina, because I just love going places. But I also love traveling because, I've gone around the world to places I never thought I'd go. I went with Donald Trump to Afghanistan. I love all of that. And to me, President Trump, when coronavirus started, he stopped traveling and then he started to pick it up again because it was the campaign. And I didn't feel comfortable going. And I look back on that now and thought, I haven't had coronavirus. Maybe I would have been fine. But I just have been extremely cautious more than other people, I feel like. I'm a parent, and I think that maybe parents, they have to think about their kids and what would happen if you get coronavirus. I mean, I don't know, maybe other people think the same thing, but I just have been very cautious. And so I didn't get to travel at all, and I didn't travel. I didn't really even go to the White House, and people were going because there were briefings and things. My editors were great, didn't said everybody should do what they feel comfortable with. So months and months and months went by, and I didn't feel comfortable. And finally, I started going back. So this is a couple months before the election, and as soon as I actually went on a trip. I went to the presidential debate, that first one where everybody was people yelling at each other that Chris Wallace moderated. And if you remember, right after that, there was a coronavirus outbreak amongst the White House
Yep.
staff. And I was like, okay, well, this is why it's like a good lesson. I was totally fine, but I had to think about that again. So I guess the short answer to your question is it's changed everything. I mean, not only travel, but going to the White House, which I used to do regularly. And more importantly, for any journalist, is those interactions you have with people in terms of you're seeing them for coffee, or you're having lunch, or you're having a drink, or you're just meeting up to chat in person, or that sort of thing. All of that is stopped. Now, I know some people are doing it, but I haven't really done any of that. I think that's particularly hard when the new administration starts because as I mentioned, I'm trying to get to know people. And normally you would say, oh, well, let's go meet for a cup of coffee near the White House. But I'm not really saying that. It's cold still. I don't want to sit outside. They're being really cautious. So it's been really, really tough. I'm hopeful for the day when that'll get better. I have started going back to the White House. The Biden team is testing everyone that comes in. They're restricting the number of people there. They're wearing masks. It does feel like they're taking it more seriously. So I feel okay about that, but it's changed everything.
Yeah, it's crazy the impact
It's depressing.
it has on so many levels. I'm curious, we're well into 2021. Hopefully, the pandemic will soon be a relatively distant memory. There's a new administration. What are some of your goals and aspirations as a reporter?
Well, I just think that my general goal right now, and I know I keep saying it, but it's just to get to know people and to get to know him, President Biden, a little bit better. And so I think that'll get easier when the pandemic goes away. and to just write stories that other people aren't writing, different things that people don't know to tell them about. I mean, when you cover the White House, you cover everything. I mean, someday it could be, coronavirus, the next day it could be about Iraq. I mean, it could be just so varied. So to me, I just want to find good stories to inform people about things they don't know. I will write a lot of immigration. I will actually still write a lot of ethics, even though people say, oh, that won't be as interesting. I still think there's interesting stories to tell. It's something that people, just because it's not Donald Trump, doesn't mean there aren't things that people should do or think about. And so I'll be writing a lot of those things as well. I think I'm just eager for it to get back to normal in terms of I can actually do the reporting part the way that I have always done it, in person and going to the White House and talking to people.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Anita, for joining me on Trailblazers today. This has been such a fantastic conversation and just so interesting to have your insights as someone that sits so close to the central leadership of our country and the free world. So really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
This is a podcast from Trailblazers Media. For more content on South Asian trailblazing, follow us at South Asian Trailblazers on Instagram and Facebook.